To welcome you here at the Makat of Sultan Qaitbey. I am Agnieszka Dobrowolska. I am directing this project. And this is my great pleasure also to welcome Dr. Dalia Wahdan tonight, an urban anthropologist who is teaching at the AUC and it's co-founder of the Gladys for Urban Studies. Dr. Dalia will talk about Cairo, but she's also acquainted with India and South Africa. And through her teaching, she will be showing us the aspect of mobility of Cairo, which everybody knows it's a very vast subject to talk. I would like to finish with a small note of apologies because this lecture was supposed to be simultaneously translated, but the last moment technical problem caused that we will not have translation. So it will be delivered in English, but if you want to ask later questions in Arabic, Dr. Dalia will answer them. So thank you very much for your attention, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Dalia.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming. I am an urban anthropologist, but I studied transportation and land issues. I will be talking about mobility in Cairo, but I will not be giving a technical discussion. I will just talk about the factors that affect mobility within the framework of the transformations that are taking place in Cairo at present. Okay, I think many of us lives in Cairo, right? Or has lived for a while in Cairo. And I hope that you have noticed that navigating in Cairo is not for the faint-hearted. If you want to walk, if you want to cycle, while there are diverse modes of mass transit, and there is no shortage of choices, by the way. There are lots of multiple modes of transportation and commuting. Yet it remains difficult for a wide range of persons to access and use mass transit facilities and end up satisfied. Certain modes of navigation or commuting are particularly difficult. For example, walking. It is indeed difficult, if not fatally hazardous, to walk certain parts of Cairo, even if you are physically and mentally fit. The same goes for cycling. Even if you don the most updated, scientifically designed protective gear, it could still be a challenge to cycle in Cairo. While it is challenging to discuss all the challenges of mobility in Cairo, it is even more challenging to understand the system, and even more challenging to talk about it, as I'm about to do today. So to make matters manageable for myself, and I hope for you as well, I thought to organize my presentation around three main aspects of mass transit in Cairo: planning, management, and users or user experiences. I will not talk about planning as a profession or an academic discipline, though I can, or even about the history of planning in Egypt. Instead, I will address the factors that affect mass transit planning at present. I will do the same with management. I will not list and compare management strategies, for example, between Cairo Transport Authority or Cairo Metro or the upcoming monorail. Instead, I will pick specific factors such as ownership, for instance, competition between different service providers, profit, and the quality of indicators as solid variables with direct impact on how mass transit is managed in Cairo. As for users, I will speak about gender as a key indicator that best captures the daily experiences of users. And by gender here, I do not mean your sex, but the identity markers that shape users' experience, like age, facilities, skin color, stuff like that. I will start with the management aspect. I will not start with the planning aspect. I'll start with the management aspect, and then onto planning, and finally with user experiences. All right. Management of mass transit facilities in Egypt has had its fair share of transformations. And management of mass transit facilities has had its fair share of transformations in Cairo. From a few private investors, زي سوارس أو مقار in the early turn of the century, to state-owned and managed facilities in the 1950s. الدولة أممت the mass transit facilities, to their deterioration in the 1970s, and then the re-privatization since the 1980s onwards. The shift of ownership and management since 1980s is important for understanding the situation of mass transit in Cairo today. Since the early 80s, the sector has been open to private players, from individual investors capable of buying and operating a single microbus service, to bigger investors such as within state institutions who have insiders access to the sector under pseudonames of their family members. The fleets of certain microbuses are owned by officers from Ministry of Interior and other branches of the ministry, to also micro-scale citizens who borrow their family money to maybe buy a rickshaw, tuk-tuk, to also cooperatives, جمعيات تعاونية, and medium-scale, mostly family enterprises, who own and operate fleets of medium-sized buses, the ones that now we call blue buses أو أتوبيسات زرقاء. Any sane person would welcome multiple service providers, because it means what? It means wider choices and also wider choices in terms of prices. Yes, this is correct, but in Cairo the situation is different. In the absence of an accountable regulator with no conflict of interest, competition is not free. The case of the microbuses is useful for illustration. And in fact, don't laugh, I studied my PhD on microbuses. Okay? So, very bad choice, I know. But anyway, I'll make it short. I realized, especially in Cairo, around Cairo also, on 6th of October, in New Cairo, in Badr, I realized that if you count the number of microbuses, you can easily pinpoint who owns them. So most of the fleet was owned, as I mentioned, by officers of different departments of the Ministry of Interior. And these people had access to insider information about the procurement standards of vans and buses, so they can decide which model to be used and when to buy it and from where to buy it and when to render it obsolete and change. The best deal commissions, the customs and tariffs, who are the middlemen who can facilitate the importation of these kinds of vans, licensing, because they are the ones who control licensing, and traffic control measures as well. And they also, parts of the Ministry of Interior also had control over the network of drivers and guides, التبعين, and also they had very good access to in-house mechanic workshops. So to make a long story short, they rendered outside competition almost difficult. This doesn't mean that they also were very good friends. They competed against each other. So this can explain why we used to witness in the early 2000s different types of microbuses operating in different routes with varying qualities, special behavior from the drivers and their assistants and guides. So I started understanding what's going on. I can list a lot of different cases. For instance, the ordeal around the tuk-tuk, whether to register it or not to register it, whether to take money to register it or not, how to register it. And back in 2009, when I was still finishing my PhD, I realized that one tuk-tuk then used to employ 10 people. So it was also a good employment generating sector. But anyway, management of mass transit is not only about who owns which vehicles. It is also about mass transit owned and managed by the public entities, such as the Cairo Transport Authority, the Cairo Underground Metro, the bus rapid transit that we are going to see working, but it also had previous attempts. The light rail, and soon the monorail. It's about how all these modes of transit are actually plying on the same land. So management is not just about managing the ownership, it's also this diversity. How is it, what is the carrying capacity of the roads of Cairo? Having said so, and by the way, just to explain why I called it natural monopoly, because in the 1950s, the state owned and operated most of the roads and the transport authorities and vehicles. And it's usually referred to as natural monopoly. It's the natural monopoly of the state. But this is disintegrating now. And of course, we can discuss how it is disintegrating or being restructured in the Q&A, because it will take us a long time. But anyway, there was a shift from natural monopoly to another form of. Okay, having said so, so the ownership is diverse, the competition is not free, access to information is not equal, pricing is controlled by whoever has the means to lower its operating costs. And of course, we all experience the differential costs of between each type of different vehicle. And also, by the way, there was a moment in the history of Cairo where there were three main operators of microbuses, and they were highly regulated by certain funds. It's called صناديق خاصة, and it was very interesting to see how they even made auctions over the routes. So not everyone is, the routes are not distributed equally or according to the capacity of the operator. Anyway, so let's take another step above ownership and the dynamics, and let's talk about planning, because after all, there must be a plan behind all this thing. And we know that Egypt, since the pharaohs, is centrally planned. There has to be someone who is in the apex of the planning system. Central planning nowadays, in the sense of a group of experts, civil or military, conducting rigorous studies and designing 5 or 10-year plans, الخطة الخمسية, الخطة العشرية, comprehensive plans that considered spatial planning, economic planning, education and health, you name it, agriculture. These were kind of centralized planning that many people are aware of. These are no longer the case in Egypt. Even though the public organizations that were responsible for planning still exist, like for instance the General Organization for Physical Planning, الهيئة العامة للتخطيط العمراني, or the Ministry of Planning. The Ministry of Planning, by the way, shifts mandates every now and then. However, the GOPP, General Organization for Physical Planning, no longer produces 5 or 10 years plans. What they do actually is very interesting. It has been hollowed out of planning departments, and other entities were created, like for instance, the Supreme Council for Planning and Urban Development, the Supreme Council for Egyptian Lands. There are lots of Supreme Councils that came up lately. But the GOPP, they did not dissolve them. They're still there, but they take them as participants in what is generally called participatory planning. They go into several initiatives and training courses, but they do not produce plans. The Ministry of Planning, on the other side, has had a major facelift. Now it assumes the apex role of orchestrating and monitoring key performance indicators laid out by global agendas, the likes of Sustainable Development Goals, the New Urban Agenda, Egypt 2030, and Cairo 2025. Interestingly, the ministry and GOPP, they produce glossy reports, prototypical reports that compete with the report of Dubai 2025 or whatever you name it, Bombay 2025. So we produce the same prototypical reports, but these reports have replaced the multi-volume plan that used to happen under state ownership, under natural monopoly. And these are, they are called plans. The 2025, the Egypt 2030, they are called plans, but when you open it, they are a set of key indicators and a set of maps. So all of a sudden, maps replaced plans. And maps here, we have a big question mark, because the maps keep, there are lots of projects that keep popping up across the map of Egypt. But do they have a relationship with each other? We don't know yet. Are they needed? We don't know yet, because they do not speak to a plan that was already laid out. Rarely does anybody raise this question. How did the map replace the plan? And what is lost along the way? In fact, when I say so, I do not imply, so please do not understand me incorrectly, I don't mean that planning has to be analog, that we do not have, we cannot use these kinds of digitized and important mediums to plan or even to think about our space, our mobility. But what I mean actually is that national planning has become recolonized by global agendas. Similarly, international development organizations, at the same time, international development organizations have been pouring funds and energies into participatory planning, localization of sustainable mobility systems, localization of sustainable development goals, and into training and monitoring on evaluation of the performance indicators. No amount, by the way, of participatory planning and localization could substitute for the absence of formal, effective, and transparent democratic institutions that represent real local needs. And of course, we are aware that local elections have been suspended for quite a while nowadays. Since 2016, planning of mobility and planning of transportation systems, the planning specialists and laypersons alike receive surprise announcements about national projects. Interest rates, media, mega projects, a monorail here, a new capital here with light rail, a connection of sort, a rapid bus transit. We don't really know ahead of time whether these projects answer to specific needs and whether they are connected to each other. So Egypt is increasingly becoming, or planning, is increasingly becoming re-centralized. The global also colonial system, as we will be hearing now when we talk about planning at a higher level, the transformations within the state apparatus of Egypt could not be overemphasized, of course, because the state itself, the government structure that caters to planning of mass transit and mobility and transportation at large, have completely changed. Not completely, but it has undergone restructuring organizationally and legislatively, such that most, if not all, planning functions are the mandate of the presidency office. The four supposedly independent national auditing institutions have also been restructured in 2015, Law 16, to report to the president. On the urban level now, where Cairo is and we navigate every day, the Supreme Council for Planning and Urban Development, for instance, do not issue plans. Instead, they stamp agreement on projects that are planned by the Ministry of Defense and its associated, of course, Armed Forces Engineering Authority. Many presidential and prime ministerial decrees have been issued since 2016, transforming public utilities, transport utilities, into financial service systems, without the powers to formulate respective sectoral plans. Also, my PhD covered the transformation that happened from هيئة الأنفاق مثلا into an economic agency that can get into the capital finance market. And MUCA as well, and other such agencies that were originally service agencies, and now they are economic agencies with the mandate. They have the right, the authority to own lands, to transact lands in the market, to issue financial instruments that can raise liquidity and get into partnerships outside even of the national territory. So this is what's happening in planning, and a little bit of how this has on the management. Of course, I will not get into cases of, for instance, what happened to Cairo Transport Authority, but let's talk about the fact that Egypt is witnessing transformations in its planning structures and dynamics, and transformations in ownership systems, and also in management systems. Having said so, let's take ourselves back a little bit on what's going on in this context. In fact, it's very interesting because the Egyptian government has been aggressively adding settlements across the country to bring the inhabited land area of up to 14%. Of course, this has implications over transportation and mobility. 12 new cities from 218 in 2007 to 130 in 2018. That's a considerable achievement. Work underway, another 15 new smart cities are being constructed around Greater Cairo, the Sinai Peninsula, the Nile Delta, Upper Egypt, North Coast, and Suez Canal. 27 cities over 380,000 acres, so you can imagine the expansion, the horizontal expansion. And in fact, it's interesting, in another source from the government itself, it says different numbers. Forget about that, it's not the issue. I made my own studies, and I think this is a reliable list. So we have 2 navigation canals, we have 22 industrial cities, 25 tourist cities, 8 airports, 3 ports, the longest monorail in the world. That's not a joke, it is the longest. 4,000 plus kilometers of roadways, logistics infrastructures, and a nuclear plant. The majority are actually transport-based projects. And these are mega projects, big projects. It seems that somehow the government all of a sudden became extremely efficient. They build big and quick. So for instance, in April 2021, the government unveiled its Sustainable Development Plan. Out of 1.25 trillion Egyptian pounds in planned public spending, the government has earmarked 700 billion for scaling up Egypt's infrastructure further. Majorly, it is energy and transportation infrastructure. During the first half of 2022, 240 billion in investment were injected into infrastructure, 75% of which were public investments, mainly allocated to transportation, 25%, real estate 13%, water drainage 9%, and construction 8%. What is going on? That is the question that I ask myself. How is it possible that the government can build big and quick, and why is transportation such a major issue? In fact, I have to admit this is a bias on my part, because I think that the answer does not lie in the need for improving mass transit facilities or transportation. The possibility that these mega projects can be made possible seems to be coming from somewhere else. And I was surprised to find something else. Where is this coming from? And I found that there are 2 major factors, forces, that converged at one point in time. A global infrastructure scramble over transportation and mega projects. There was a need somewhere, created somewhere else, that we need to put a lot of money and a lot of technologies into transportation infrastructure. And another very parallel, but they actually converged, was a shifting in the dynamics and the architecture of international development. So I'm sure you are aware of the World Bank, I'm sure you are aware of international non-governmental organizations, surprisingly, there was already a shift in the mandate after the financial crisis. They changed the mandates. There was shifts in the mandates. You are pushed as an international development organization to put money, pour money into specific sectors. Let's explain a little bit of that. The global infrastructure scramble driven by what? Surpluses in technologies. We know that China has a lot of technologies. We know that the West has a lot of technology, and they also have a lot of money. So it was interesting to find that at a specific moment after the financial crisis, there was a meeting in Basel, and they released a framework urging banks, international development banks, to reduce a little bit of their lending in the form of long-term loans and direct it into certain types of financial instruments targeting infrastructure projects, mega infrastructure projects. So they were advised to reduce a little bit of the long-term loans, the loans that we know and we're familiar with, قرض من البنك, into a different type of financing. This doesn't mean that the loans have stopped, but it's according to the Basel Agreement, it was to be reduced to 30% of the international banking and institutions' capacity. At the same time, as I mentioned, multilateral development organizations, including big ones like the UNDP, like all the international non-governmental organizations, also had to, they were given the authority, the mandate, to also get into the capital market, the finance capital market. It's another way of saying, instead of countries like Egypt or Senegal or other countries in sub-Saharan Africa borrowing directly from the World Bank, they can now borrow from individuals, rich investors. They can borrow from commercial banks. They can borrow from bilateral lenders who are interested to get their money going. But at the same time, in order to make everything look good, there was a narrative that came out that there is indeed an infrastructure need and a gap. And all of a sudden, something like the World Bank established the Global Infrastructure Hub. This hub was responsible for coming up with numbers about each country's need for mega infrastructure projects. So, and the numbers were big. So for instance, the idea that these three forces, a narrative that is being well forged, serving the new direction after the financial crisis and the need to circulate excess technologies and excess liquidity. And at the same time, there is a multilateral development organizations that need to come into the capital market. The G20 created the Global Infrastructure Hub, which started doing something very interesting also, beside issuing numbers about the infrastructure needs of Egyptians or Senegalese or Ghanaians. They also started to sell the infrastructure asset class as like the financial instruments for circulating the infrastructures, and at the same time linked it to the Sustainable Development Goals. So it became very important if you want to reach a particular level of, on the indicator of safe cities, that you have to get the safe cities via the new forms of investments and via the new forms of finance. So there was a link between the UN Sustainable Development Goals from one side and the finance imperatives from the other, and of course the appetite and the taste of investors, private investors. They don't have to be institutions. So everything came to converge on making mega transport infrastructures a needed investment. And the discourse of infrastructure gap is huge. Like Egypt, for instance, is estimated to have 1.2 trillion investments, and there's a gap, a huge gap of some 675 billion This is the expected need of Egypt for transportation infrastructure and energy, of which 440 is expected to be government authorities. All right, anyway, that is the narrative, and it's quite interesting to also to take up one number and investigate. Do we really need this amount? Do we need the projects that are worthy or that as expensive? Anyway, yes, we do. The new republic, yes, we do. If we want to establish a new republic, we do have to upgrade our transport system. We cannot depend on the tuk-tuk, and we cannot rely on the existing badly managed mass transit services. But in order to do these kinds of mega projects, you have to have land, because infrastructure doesn't happen in the air. It's a sunk-in investment, so you need to have land. So land is essential to infrastructure and to real estate as well. Countries of the global south, including Egypt, have chronic inefficiencies in land markets. Come on, you know Cairo well. You know how crowded it is. You know that it is difficult also to navigate because of the nature of the market. And I can go into the issue of land markets in Egypt if you wish. However, I'll speak of Egypt to illustrate that, for instance, the financial term in infrastructure spending, that's not monetary. So we don't, the government did not build the monorail or the new admin capital by borrowing money. It was able to do that by issuing certain financial instruments. These are not just money. The financial turn in infrastructure drives the state to expand and consolidate land banks, and it explains why Hayat al-Anfaq, which doesn't own land, now can have land bank and can make transactions over land. The financial turn in infrastructure drives the state to expand and consolidate land banks and to deploy diverse value capture instruments. سمعتوا طبعا أكيد على رسوم التحسين, betterment levies, reconciliation, قانون التصالح, real estate, the property taxation systems, development rights, the sale and purchase of development rights, land leasing, like ports being leased for 35 years, and other, so special economic zones. These are all instruments to allow the government to generate value over and above the use of land, even sometimes, and in most cases, without using the land. Some of which, oops. Some of these instruments also have been in use since the 1990s. So these are not something that the current government has invented. It has been in the books since the 1990s, very much working along the same line of the economic restructuring and structural adjustment program, economic reform and structural adjustment program. So many of the projects that we see now have been in the drawers. It's only that there was the moment, the historical moment, where the need of international investors was ripe. Let's not forget also that the government has also upped its use of eminent domain, نزع الملكية, and other instruments that allow the government to release lands. And I guess while others were dormant or forgotten, while such instruments might have been forgotten in the 50s, they have been brought out of the drawer. And also many other seemingly ad hoc policies in order to allow state agencies that are mostly now economic agencies, هيئات اقتصادية, to be able to make sense of its assets, of the land. Yes, there are also voices coming up against this, especially when the land evictions came to the Islamic Cairo, and we witnessed everyone who respects the heritage and who respects livelihoods. But anyway, still, the voices are not orchestrated, and maybe we can talk about how to orchestrate the voices later. But the point that I'm trying to make is that already the current government is takes pride in its capacity to clear lands and to open up the spaces for investments in mega infrastructure projects, whether this is transport system like the monorail or other such forms of investments. It's interesting also to mention that the ISDF, I don't know if you are familiar with the Informal Settlements Development Fund, which was overnight transformed into the Urban Development Fund. And instead of upgrading, although the group believes that they are upgrading slums, what they have actually done is clear lands across, and I think the case of Fustat is very illustrative, that in less than 6 months, there were like 5 areas completely wiped out. Azbat Abu Arn, Al Khayala, and so on and so forth. And the land is now, very interestingly, either widened roads to serve the transportation or multiple bridges over new axes, but at the same time also we have a very good garden. I don't know how much is the ticket, maybe £100. We can all go to Fustat Hills, but anyway. What I'm trying to say, if you want to understand what I'm saying, there is the state ownership policy document has most of the places that will eventually be used as land banks or for land transactions. As land becomes the primary vehicle for value generation and private finance dictates the temporal and the spatial logics, the threat of course, nationalization is diluted, but instead the government assumes a new role, and that is of de-risking the investments. So if you're a good investor, if you're rich enough, rest assured that the government will de-risk your investments. And the de-risking can happen in different formats, even if it means wiping out the people from their own neighborhoods or wiping even the dead out of their graves. When dispossession is mentioned, it is understandable why the poor readily come to mind. Although officially we are 29.7% poor of the 107 million persons, nevertheless the policies put into practice to meet the financial and real estate speculative activities targeting mega infrastructure projects, particularly transportation projects, trigger a cascade of vulnerabilities. So it's not only the poor that are vulnerable, it's also the middle classes whose neighborhoods, whose buildings are losing value as residents. Old rent is being shifted. So the point I'm trying to make is that all these forces that are happening somewhere out there are actually affecting our understanding of what happens in the field of mass transit as we speak. Okay, it's too early, of course, to measure whether these mega projects will eventually make our mass transit experiences better or not. However, it is important to understand the dynamics. So having said so, I still have the wish to ask the questions about whether these kinds of mega projects on infrastructure are about economic growth. Will they really generate economic growth? Will they really spread equality? Are they really about inclusion? Are they sustainable? Thinking about their financing system. I ask these questions, and I also ask other questions. I'm finished with that. I don't want to get into the last 2 slides. But anyway, having talked about management of transport systems, having talked about planning and what happened to mass transit and physical planning, the appetites internationally to give the countries that are lower in the financial market a push towards mega infrastructure projects and to give them the right way of investment. And if they cannot pay for issuing certain types of financial instruments, there is always the traditional system of lending, so the World Bank can come in, lend some money so that the country can buy and issue other financial instruments in order to be able to make these mega infrastructure projects. The last thing that remains are user experiences. What does this mean for the experience of daily commuting in a city like Cairo? In a book published in February 2024, myself and a colleague of mine, Dr. Lamia Bulbul, who is a sociologist and a gender specialist, over 11 chapters, one of the authors is here, we tried to understand, to capture the experiences of users, and of course, I mean, I don't want to be banal and tell you, yes, the systems, whether it is the 1980s, 1990s systems or the new systems, are actually exclusionary. So for instance, if you're a senior citizen with disabilities, surely you might not find your due mass transit vehicle. If you're a pregnant young woman, if you're a migrant, if you're living in an area that is unplanned, but your means of livelihood is in the new Cairo or in 6th of October or Sheikh Zayed, then this means that you'll have to suffer a lot, not just in terms of finding, because as I mentioned, there are multiple means of transportation. But an estimated, like we did our calculations, might not be correct, we estimated that every household, the 32% now of its monthly income goes for transportation, taken away from food and sometimes from education, and definitely from recreation. So in a sense, I don't want to market the book, but the book does have lots of experiences ethnographically about also women using Uber. What does digitization of mass transit systems do? What do they do? Are they good for inclusion and equality? Are they going to compensate for the physical planning that is exclusionary, as we mentioned? So all these questions can be discussed in the Q&A. I was told to speak for 40 minutes. So we can discuss any issues at length, but now I finished what I wanted to say. Thank you. I would like to end with that because we're never ending development, inshallah. All right, thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I found the concept of national monopoly of voting very interesting, and I was wondering if you could speak a bit about how the process started.
Natural monopoly is very simply a term that refers to the situation where a government takes responsibility of everything. So for instance, electricity, generation of electricity. The government is responsible for generating, building the high dam, for instance, the turbines, maintaining the turbines, making sure that the hydroelectric power is distributed equally across every area in the city. So they are generation, distribution, maintenance, billing, and collection. So the 5 different sectors of this particular infrastructure is owned and managed by the government. And this has shifted in 1985. In fact, it was Margaret Thatcher and Reagan who started this whole thing about lean government and retrenching or rollback of the state. And instead of the government actually owning and managing all the 5 sectors, so they unbundled the sectors from each other. So generation and the establishment of big hydroelectric power stations remains in the government as a public sector with different sources of financing. But the distribution is also a public-private partnerships, the PPPs. So the distribution is given with rules, because otherwise if I am going as a private investor to be responsible for distribution. I might decide that Qina, for instance, they are very poor. I'm not going to get any profit from them, so I'm not going to extend electricity or the grid. So there are rules in this, but it is halfway, not halfway, but it is managed by public and private. But the three other dimensions, for instance, like maintenance, it could be by private corporation, billing can be another, and collection. And in fact, the argument is that when you unbundle a natural monopoly, you increase efficiency. Because, for instance, I'm sure now it's very difficult to evade paying your electricity bill. So it is privatized. And the pricing itself, the ticket itself, the billing itself is also recalibrated in the agreement. So this is, put simply, that is exactly the difference between a natural monopoly and an unbundled system of managing and owning infrastructure projects. It's interesting to see this in the transportation sector. The transportation sector is quite interestingly in Egypt and elsewhere, even in India and in South Africa also. The transport sector, the mass transit, not the transportation, not the roadways and the expressways, not the network of roads, but the vehicles and who operates and owns the vehicles, have already been not in the hands of the public sector. In fact, it deteriorated when it became solely managed by a natural monopoly. Although there are question marks, because I don't know how many of you here have witnessed the pre-2011 discussions in Cairo Transport Authority, هيئة النقل العام, because الهيئة ما كانتش مفلسة, and it wasn't bankrupt as was originally said. But of course, that's a different discussion altogether. Thank you. Welcome.
Why is financially more safe to invest in infrastructure and public transport? I mean, you discussed the agreement with the big guys that we go for infrastructure, but also countries can afford. If there's a financial crisis like what happened to 2008, countries can do it.
Of course.
Especially that most of this investments are working with global stars, so there's a high chance.
Yes, of course. Okay. I'll try to be very specific or simple. Okay, so financing infrastructures through different forms of lending, like the bond issues, the capital market, the debt capital market. You're buying debt, you're selling debt. There are certain rules here. For instance, if this is a country that can default, then the risk value is very high, right? But the interest and the revenue is also very high. So investors say, all right, hit and run. I can buy a bond in this particular country quickly, because the conditions of the bond are also unlike a long-term investment. Some bonds are long-term, but the ones that are issued in Egypt and the ones that are sold to Egypt for issuance are usually questionable, in the sense that they are, number one, like the green bond that funded the monorail. So the green bond, the issuance was excellent, and it was praised. Egypt got an award for issuing a green bond, but the problem is, how long, what is the maturity, how long can Egypt repay the original amount, how much is the upfront interest rate, and at the same time, the big question, the use of proceeds. Where did the use of proceeds of issuance go? And it did not go only to the monorail. In fact, it went to 136 projects that are still not at all even initiated. The default بقى, and the default of course is there, but as I mentioned, there are investors who are ready to invest in high risk because it's higher revenue. High risk, high revenue. Low risk, low revenue. But now, for instance, a green bond has been issued in Mexico City for transportation system. But the type of bond between here and there, this was a green impact bond. So the investor wants to wait for Mexico until the impact of the green project starts appearing. But in our sense, we don't have it's a green bond that is not impact tied. We have also something called outcome bonds. So the bond payment or repayment is tied to the positive outcome. Egypt has never, not to my knowledge, issued something like that. The type of bonds that are issued are short, some are non-convertible, some are convertible. Convertible as in the sense of you default, I take your land. Some are not. So it is, you are correct. And that's why they do credit rating. If you have a double A or a double B credit rating, you ensure that this bond will sell immediately in less than a week, that the investors who are going to buy it are the likes of the Deutsche Bank and the Bank of America or other institutions, individuals. But I know that these types of bonds, like the green bond, has not been offered to retail to people. Otherwise, I think good Egyptians would have. We have collected. ما احنا عملنا كده في قناة السويس. Or you could have rushed to buy. That's a very good question, depending on the type of the bond. But a large part of why these bonds are sold to investors is because infrastructure is usually the safest asset class. Because it is sunk in if you're going to use it. But of course, there is no guarantee. Of course, there is no guarantee, and if a revolution happens tomorrow, the infrastructure, the value would be lost. But that's how it is labeled. That infrastructure is usually. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's go and enjoy the music. Thank you.
So I would like to thank Dr. Dalia and you for the attendance. And the evening goes on. So if you want to listen to the music, just wait until 8 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.